I came back from the war in 1919 with my uniform still intact, and my name still my own. Back then, they told men like me we were lucky, survivors. They said the country would take care of us, that there would be work, that life would settle back into something normal. For a while, it almost felt true. Then 1929 came. I watched entire towns slow down until they stopped altogether. Factories shut their doors, banks disappeared overnight, and men who had worked their whole lives found themselves standing in line just to eat. It didn't take long before I was one of them. No job, no home, and a past no one cared to hear about. That's when I started riding the rails. Freight trains, mostly. Moving from one town to the next, taking whatever work I could find, just enough to get through the day. Men like me were everywhere by then. Some had lost everything in the crash. Others, like me, had already lost something long before. The crash just finished the job. But hunger wasn't the worst part. Neither was the cold. The worst part was that I wasn't alone. My brother died in the war. I saw it happen. Buried him with my own hands. Or at least, that's what I've told myself all these years. But ever since I started living out on the rails, something hasn't sat right. Because some nights, when the train slows down and the world gets too quiet, I hear footsteps that don't belong to me. And the longer I stay out here, the more I start to wonder if I ever really made it back from that war at all. If you're listening to this story right now, tell me where you're listening from. There's something strange about knowing a voice can travel that far. Back in my time, all we really had was silence. If this story reaches you in any way, take a moment. Leave a like, share your thoughts, subscribe to the channel. Not for me, but because some stories, they need to be heard all the way through. Back in those years after 1929, a word started showing up more often than most people cared to notice. Hobo. That's what they called men like me. It didn't just mean a man without a home. It meant someone who followed the rails, moving from town to town, looking for whatever work could keep him fed for another day. That distinction mattered. We weren't drifters in the way people liked to think. We worked when there was work. The problem was, the whole country had run out of it. I didn't start out that way by choice. When I came back from the war, I managed for a while. Small jobs, quiet routine, nothing that drew attention. But when the crash hit, it took things fast. Factories closed, wages stopped, and whatever I had put aside disappeared, trying to hold on to a life that was already slipping. After that, the options narrowed down to something simple. Stay still and starve, or move and take your chances. So I started riding the rails, same as thousands of others, because at least the trains were still going somewhere. There wasn't anything free about that kind of life. No matter what some people liked to say, it was survival, plain and steady. You learned which towns would tolerate you and which ones would run you off without warning. You learned how to get on a freight car without being seen, how to get off before trouble found you, how to sleep light and wake faster. There was even a kind of code between men like us, marks scratched onto fences or posts, warning the next man what he might find ahead. Food, work, or danger. It was the kind of system that only exists when everything else stops working. I spent years that way, never staying long enough in one place to build anything close to a life. And after a while, I started to understand it wasn't just the world I was avoiding, it was everything that came with it. Houses reminded me of who I used to be. Families reminded me of what I didn't have anymore. And the silence of a closed room, that was the worst of it, because that's where things came back the clearest. Out on the rails, at least there was noise. Steel grinding, wind cutting across your face, the steady motion of something that never really stopped. It helped keep the mind occupied, but not always, especially at night, when the train slowed down and the world seemed to hold its breath. That's when I started hearing things that didn't belong. Footsteps, faint, deliberate, sometimes more than that, something closer to a presence than a sound. And the longer I stayed out there, the harder it became to pretend it was coming from inside my own head. It was in the winter of 1932 that things began to change for real. Up until then, whatever I carried with me could still be ignored most days, like an old injury that only makes itself known when the weather turns or the body wears down too far. But that year was different. The cold came early, and it came hard. It had a way of getting into your bones and staying there. I was crossing Kansas then, catching rides on freight trains that moved slow through small towns, many of them already half empty. And the less life there was around me, the harder it became to keep pretending I was alone. One night, the train came to a stop just short of a station that looked like it had been dead for years. I climbed down to stretch my legs and find some kind of shelter before the line started moving again. There was an old building nearby, maybe a storage shed once, maybe a depot. Hard to tell in the dark. The door hung loose on one hinge, groaning every time the wind touched it. I went in because there wasn't much else to do. Inside, the place smelled like old timber, rust, and damp air. But what I noticed most was the silence. Not the ordinary kind. This was heavier than that. Closed in. Waiting. I heard the sound before I let myself name it. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, measured. Coming from somewhere behind me. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the boards settling under the cold. There was rhythm to it. Weight. Someone moving with intention. I didn't turn right away. I stood there still, trying to force my mind toward some plain explanation, something simple enough to keep hold of. But the sound kept coming. One step, then another, and after that something I hadn't heard in years but would have known anywhere, breathing. I turned too fast, the way a man does when he'd rather meet the worst of it head-on than wait for it to reach him. There was nobody there, just darkness, broken beams, and thin strips of moonlight slipping through the walls. But the air had changed. In one spot near the back of the room, it felt warmer, as if someone had been standing there only seconds before. I stared at that patch of space longer than I care to admit, and for one brief moment, I was sure that if I took another step forward, I'd see him. I didn't. I went back to the train before it started moving again, and pulled myself up into the freight car without once looking over my shoulder. But I didn't sleep that night, not even for a minute, because what happened in that building no longer felt like memory or hunger or some leftover damage from the war. It had weight to it, presence. And for the first time since all of this began, I let myself consider something I had spent years pushing away. Maybe I wasn't being followed at all. Maybe somehow I was being waited for. After that night in the depot, I started paying attention to things I had spent years trying to ignore. Small things, mostly. Gaps in the silence that felt too long to be natural. Sudden shifts in the air when there was no weather coming. Places where the dark seemed to settle heavier than it should have. When you live along the rails, you learn to read your surroundings the way other men read a newspaper. You learn when trouble is near, when someone is watching, when it's time to move. And my instincts, honed by war, sharpened by years of sleeping light, began telling me this was no trick of the nerves. Whatever it was, it had purpose. For a while, I tried staying near other men. There were camps scattered along the tracks then, little more than makeshift fires and patched blankets, where hobos shared food, rumors, and whatever work they'd heard might be waiting in the next town. The noise helped. Men talking low, tin cups shifting in the dirt, boots scraping the ground. It gave the mind something to hold on to. But even there, among men as worn down and half forgotten as I was, the world sometimes seemed to pull away from me without warning. The sound would thin out. The fire would seem farther off. And in those moments I'd feel it again, close enough that my skin would tighten before my thoughts caught up. It happened one night while I was sitting near the fire, eating beans out of a dented tin cup. I heard my name spoken clear as anything. Not loud, not urgent, just low and steady, like the voice already knew I would hear it no matter how softly it came. I froze with the spoon halfway to my mouth. Nobody there knew my name. I made certain of that everywhere I went. Names had a way of inviting questions, and I had no use for questions. I lifted my head slowly and looked across the fire, past the smoke, into the edge of the dark. That was when I saw it. It wasn't clear the way seeing another man is clear. It wasn't solid, but it wasn't imagination either. It had shape. It took up space. It stood just beyond the firelight, still as a fence post, and for one long second everything else around me stopped mattering. The voices faded. The flames lost their sound. Even the cold seemed to pull back, because I knew him before my mind could put words to it. I knew the line of his shoulders, the way he held his head, the quiet in him. It was my brother, or something left behind in the shape of him. I didn't move, and neither did he. We stood there with a lifetime and a few feet of ground between us. Then slowly, he stepped back, not like something vanishing, and not like a man fleeing, more like someone refusing to be followed. And in that instant, something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't undo. For years, I had believed this presence was after me, hunting me from one rail line to the next. But what I felt then was different, older, stranger, as if I hadn't been the one running from it at all, as if, all this time, I had simply kept crossing back into its path. After that night, I stopped trying to outrun it, not because I had found any courage I didn't have before, and not because the fear had eased. It was simpler than that. I had begun to understand there was nowhere left to go, that this thing, whatever it was, couldn't reach me. For years, I had told myself I was moving forward, one freight car after another, one town after the next, one hard season giving way to another. But the truth was, I had been circling the same place all along. Distance didn't weaken what followed me. If anything, it sharpened it. So I began digging into memories I had spent years keeping buried. Not the cleaned-up version a man tells himself so he can keep putting one foot in front of the other, but the raw one, the one that sits underneath all the rest. The day my brother died had always seemed clear enough in my mind. There had been an explosion, a hard crack through the air, then dirt, smoke, shouting, confusion. I remembered running toward him. I remembered seeing a body on the ground. I remembered believing with the certainty only grief can give that it was him. That was the story I had lived with, straight enough to carry, painful, but settled. But the more I forced myself to look at it without mercy, the less steady it became. Small details started slipping out of place. The angle of the bodies, the few seconds between the blast and when I reached them, the feeling in my own chest at that exact moment. Not sorrow, not at first, but something more urgent, more divided. It was like trying to piece together a broken photograph and realizing the parts had been rearranged years ago. The more closely I examined it, the clearer it became that something in my memory had been shifted, whether by fear, guilt, or something worse. I kept riding the rails, but by then it no longer felt like escape. It felt more like being led back, piece by piece, towards something unfinished. The nights grew heavier, not just because of the presence I had finally stopped denying, but because of the images that came with it. They weren't full visions, and they weren't dreams. They arrived in pieces, pressure on my chest, dirt in my mouth, the helpless weight of not moving fast enough. It wasn't memory in the ordinary sense anymore. It was closer to being made to live through something my mind had spent years trying to soften. Then one night, sitting awake in a boxcar between two nameless towns, it all began to settle into place. I felt that presence in front of me again, closer than ever, not hidden, not distant, but there in a way I could no longer explain away. When I raised my eyes, I didn't see my brother as someone who had simply been taken from me. I saw someone who had been left, and that was the first moment I allowed myself to admit what had been waiting underneath every false memory I had carried. There had always been two versions of that day living inside me. I had just chosen, for years, to believe the one that let me keep moving. It took me longer than it should have, but when the truth finally rose to the surface, it didn't come like a lightning strike. There was no sudden collapse, no dramatic moment of revelation. It came quietly, the way some things do when they've been living inside a man for too many years to be called new. I sat still in that boxcar and let the memory come without trying to shape it, excuse it, or turn it into something easier to bear. For the first time, the pieces didn't fight each other. They settled into place, and what they formed was plain enough to understand, even if it was harder than anything I had ever carried. The explosion happened the way I had always remembered it. Quick, violent, final in the way only war can be. That part had never changed. What I changed was everything that came after. For years, I had told myself I found my brother already gone, that there was nothing left to be done by the time I reached him. It was a story clean enough to survive on. But it wasn't the truth. When I got there was more than one man on the ground. The dirt was still settling. The smoke was still thick in the air. And somewhere inside all that confusion, one of them was still alive. I can see it clearly now in a way I spent years refusing to. My brother was there, wounded beyond help, still in a way that told me more than words ever could. Beside him was another man from our unit, broken but breathing, trying to hold on. And in those few seconds, while the noise of battle carried on around us, I understood exactly what was in front of me. That is the part that stayed buried the longest. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't panic. It wasn't confusion clouding my judgment. It was a choice, a terrible one, made in a moment no man should have to live through. But a choice, all the same. I pulled the man who was still breathing. I took hold of him and dragged him clear, step by step, leaving my brother where he lay. I did not go back. I did not kneel beside him. I did not give him whatever comfort a dying man might have taken from hearing his own blood call his name one last time. And afterward, when the days passed, and the war kept moving like it always did, I began changing the memory. Not all at once, just enough at first to make it bearable. I swapped the order of things. I erased what I could. I turned my decision into fate, because fate is easier to live with than failure. That was why he never left me. He wasn't chasing me across the rails, and he wasn't rising out of the dark to punish me. He was still there, in that moment, exactly where I had left him. Every footstep I heard, every presence I felt, every time the silence around me seemed to tighten. None of it was him coming closer. It was me returning, again and again, without meaning to, back to the only place I had never truly left. And when I finally understood that, something inside me went still, not lighter, not healed, just still. When the train slowed, I climbed down and stood beside the tracks in the cold. For the first time since the war, I did not keep moving. I simply stopped. Some decisions don't end in the moment they're made. They go on living long after, quietly shaping everything that comes next, even when a man does his best to bury them. I spent years believing I was running from something that was following me, when the truth was much simpler than that. I was only avoiding the one place where everything had remained exactly as I left it. In the end, it was never really about getting home or finding peace. It was about stopping long enough to face what had been waiting for me all along.